I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today we discuss the latest from the Kharkiv battlefield, hear warnings from Norwegian intelligence of Russian sabotage operations across Europe, ask whether there's about to be a shift in US policy over the use of Western weapons inside Russia, and later we hear about a new film exploring the soldier's road to redemption.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 23rd of May, 2 years and 90 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley and former paratrooper, now explorer, travel writer and documentary filmmaker Levison Wood. I started with the latest news from Ukraine. Let's start up in the north around Chansk. Geolocated footage from yesterday shows Russian and Ukrainian forces have both advanced in different parts of the town of Vovchansk, so still a lot of fighting going on there. It's quite fluid. Not huge changes to sort of Russia's disposition. They're not breaking out, but there's clearly a lot of fighting going on. More geolocated footage elsewhere in the country from yesterday suggests Ukraine has advanced very slightly to the east of Chasiv Yar. Russia has advanced, again, very slightly to the west and also southwest of Donetsk city. Now, back up in the north, Russian forces carried out 15 strikes against Kharkiv and the wider oblast yesterday. It's thought to have been with S-300 missiles. This comes from the regional prosecutor's office spokesperson, Dmitry Jabenko. He was speaking to Suspiln, that's the national public broadcaster of Ukraine. More on that in a moment. But Russia also launched strikes with KAB bombs against Kharkiv, the glide bombs against Kharkiv and the nearby town of Dearnley. That's about 5 km northwest of Kharkiv. Governor Ole Sibinov reporting there. The glide bombs, just as a reminder, these relatively new innovation. They're very old weapons, but a new innovation. Glide bombs, they are built by taking a very old, in many cases, Soviet-era dumb bomb, adding fold-out wings and a satellite navigation pack, and then they're turned into this new weapon of glide bombs. They're significantly cheaper than cruise missiles or ballistic missiles. The KAB that it's referred to, it stands for, here we go, Korrektiruomaya Aviatsonaya Bomba, which means adjustable aircraft bomb. Okay, so it's a bomb that's got wings, and it's a satellite guided, supposed to have more accuracy than just sort of gravity dumb bombs. Anyway, in Kharkiv, the missiles and these bombs caused deaths and injuries. The last report I saw about 20 minutes ago, 7 dead and over 20, I think, injured at the Vivat printing house and bookshop. That's a place where, it sells books, as you'd imagine, and it's where folk go to talk about art and literature. Regional Police Chief Volodymyr Timoshko, he said, this is a purely civilian site. It is a print works that prints books. Right, a slight segue, if you will forgive me. So I read that, and I went and had a look at the website of it's a bit of a clunky title, but the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. Quite long-winded, but it sort of says what it does. Now, the UN Office says, quote, to constitute genocide, there must be a proven intent on the part of perpetrators to physically destroy a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Cultural destruction does not suffice, end quote. There's a lot of talk about this is genocide. Russia is trying to wipe out the Ukrainian national identity through destroying cultural sites and icons. Okay, so I had a look into it. The office carries on, the UN office, it says, quote, the popular understanding of what constitutes genocide tends to be broader than the content of the norm under international law. Article 2 of the Genocide Convention contains a narrow definition of the crime of genocide, which includes 2 main elements. A mental element, that is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial or religious group, and a physical element, which includes a number of acts like killing, causing serious harm, imposing measures intended to prevent births, and forcibly transferring children. Okay, so I've read all that out. That's from the UN site. I say them, and I quote directly, because we have to be very careful when talking about genocide. It's a phrase that is bandied around far too much. And if we're to be taken seriously, journalists and informed citizens, we've got to be correct. Okay, so if we are incorrect and just rage and throw this term around, it muddies the waters of the issue and only works to Putin's favour. So I hope you don't think I'm trying to patronise you here, but we have to arm ourselves with the facts in order to dismantle all the disinformation that comes the other way. So for my money, I am reasonably content that the UN is saying cultural destruction alone, my word alone, but cultural destruction alone does not suffice to say it's a genocide. But I think the manner in which Russia is trying to destroy Ukrainian culture is killing and causing serious bodily and mental harm. Plus, don't forget, we know Russia is forcibly transferring children. So that, to me, does look like an attempted genocide. However, that's my two penneth. Go and have a look at the UN site, make your own mind up. But we've just got to be absolutely careful and correct on the language that we use so that our arguments stand up. Anyway, back to the updates. More military activities outside Ukraine. Lieutenant General Vadim Shamarin, who's a deputy chief of the Russian armed forces, so Gerasimov's deputy, basically. He is or was also head of the main Directorate of Communications. He's been detained for allegedly receiving bribes. This comes from Russia's state-owned news agency RIA Novosti, speaking yesterday. Now, another state-controlled outlet, Kommersant, said that General Shamarin had been put under arrest for a period of 2 months. He's the fourth arrest of high-ranking defence figure in the space of a month. You'll remember back in April, now former Deputy Defence Minister Timur Ivanov was detained on suspicion of bribery. Then there was Lieutenant General Yuri Kuznetsov, the head of the personnel department for the Russian MOD. He was detained on May the 13th. And then just earlier this week, Major General Ivan Popov, the former commander of Russia's 58th Combined Arms Army, which was fighting in Ukraine, he was arrested on suspicion of fraud. So what's going on here? Is this some kind of putsch? Is this Putin clearing out, feeling more emboldened after the quote unquote election? We don't know, but there's big changes at the top, and of course Shoigu's gone as well. Next one, the UK administered International Fund for Ukraine has announced another £150 million worth of support. That's going to be about 70 million quid on air defence radars, counter drone and counter electronic warfare kit. And then 80 million on stuff for the big blue wobbly stuff, maritime capabilities. It's going to be small boats, reconnaissance drones, loitering munitions, and underwater mine clearance drones as well. So lots of droney stuff there. The IFU, that's the International Fund for Ukraine, so far received more than 900 million quid. The UK's put in 500 million of that. This is an ad hoc alliance. Alliance is probably too strong a word. An ad hoc grouping made up of, so the Balts and the Scandis have got stuck in straight away. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Sweden, and Norway. Then the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, Poland, Iceland, and the UK. So the kind of a bit Jeff-like, the Joint Expeditionary Force, a little bit in, not exactly, but the kind of North European beer-drinking nations of NATO getting involved there. Sticking with Sweden, Sweden has announced a long-term military support package for Ukraine worth 75 billion Swedish krona. That's about $7 billion US dollars over 3 years. That's going on defense equipment, financial support in cash terms, and financial support for defense procurement. Going to be spread evenly over 3 years. So I was doing a couple of calculations. GDP of about $600 billion a year, Sweden. So this equates to, this 3-year thing, equates to about 0.37% of GDP per year for 3 years. Now, you'll remember Estonia, at the end of last year, Estonia put out this plan that NATO countries should commit 0.25%, a quarter of 1% of GDP to Ukraine every year for 4 years. That would give them a steady flow of money upon which they can plan to build up the defence industrial base. So Sweden coming up with 0.37 for 3 years is pretty much in the ballpark there. So nice one, Sweden. Just need to look to others to try and do the same. Now, from Sweden, head a little west, you get to Norway, lovely crinkly edges. Officials there said yesterday that Russian intelligence services intend to increase sabotage activities and other hybrid operations against NATO member countries. Now, hybrid stuff, what are we talking about here? No specific agreed definition, but hybrid operations are seen, as the name suggests, a mix of different types of aggressive behavior, generally taken to be short of war. So includes disinformation, but also probably includes things like the Novichok nerve agent attack in the UK in 2018, which did kill people, to kill a person. So hybrid doesn't always mean non-lethal. But that's what you'll see the term used in that way. Anyway, now sticking with Norway, Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, they say that Norway's police security service and the Norwegian intelligence service, speaking yesterday, said that there's an increased threat of Russian sabotage against Norwegian arms suppliers and other organisations involved in the logistics side of the delivery of military aid to Ukraine. The PST counterintelligence head Inge Haugland warned Norwegian arms suppliers to be on high alert and has previously said Russian actors are planning acts of sabotage in western Norway, where there are a lot of military naval bases and oil and gas infrastructure. Haugland said Russian security services have used non-Russian nationals to conduct sabotage in Poland, Germany and the UK in order to have deniability. We've seen that in the UK. Seen some British people currently charged with acts which are thought to have been supporting of, if not paid by, Russia. Now, Francis, I think, covered on yesterday's episode comments from Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, when he was warning earlier this week that Polish authorities have recently arrested and charged 9 suspects for engaging in acts of sabotage in Poland on behalf of Russian security services. So there's quite a lot of this going on, if not all being reported around the same time. And sticking with Norway, and the Kremlin has said that it will retaliate after Norway has decided to further restrict entry to Russian tourists, effectively banning them. The Kremlin says this is discriminatory, which it is. I've no problem with that. So they say, who's this? Sorry. Emily Enger-Mehl, this is Norway's Justice Minister, in a statement this morning said the decision to tighten the entry rules is in line with the Norwegian approach of standing by allies and partners in reaction to Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. So Russian citizens whose purpose is tourism and other non-essential travel will be rejected upon entry across the external border, they say. Exceptions will be granted, or may be granted, in cases such as visits to close relatives, close family residing in Norway, the ministry said, the Justice Ministry. Of course, the Kremlin then had a normal one. Dmitry Peskov this morning said, of course, such decisions cannot go unanswered. Of course, the decision is purely discriminatory. We do not accept such decisions. Mate, it's not for you to accept it or not. It's happening. He said, we regret that the Norwegian leadership has chosen this way of worsening our bilateral relations, which have already been of poor quality recently and not on our initiative. Yeah, nice one, Dmitry. There's some interesting moves on the political front for which we need the F-bomb to talk us through. So, Francis, what's been happening on the diplomatic front?
Well, thanks, Tom. Well, the biggest news is a major development in the United States today. As listeners to recent episodes will know, the key cause of frustration in Ukraine at the moment is the restrictions imposed on the use of Western-provided weapons on Russian territory. What that means in reality is Ukrainian troops have to watch Russian forces massing just across the border, which they cannot attack with those weapons. They have to wait for them to march across that invisible line to then launch assaults on Kharkiv and elsewhere. In a military sense, those restrictions are, of course, illogical and hugely limiting to the Ukrainian ability to wage war. Britain and Latvia were the first to give the green light to Kyiv to use the weapons they provide on Russian territory, something that really rattled Moscow, as we reported. But we learned today from the New York Times, citing undisclosed official sources, that the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is reportedly backing a plan to allow US missiles donated to Ukraine to be fired into Russia. Of course, Blinken has just got back from Kyiv, and I imagine that was one of President Zelensky's major requests, if not the major request. Incredibly, as long-standing listeners will appreciate, Mike Johnson, the Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives, appears to back the idea as well. Responding to a question last night from Voice of America, Johnson said the US should allow Ukraine to prosecute the war in the way they see fit. Ukraine needs to be able to fight back. And I think us trying to micromanage the effort there is not a good policy for us, he added. One can only assume that he and Blinken are seeing the same intelligence reports and thereby reaching similar conclusions. Make no mistake, as listeners will appreciate, this is a really significant shift and would be yet a further sign of what was once deemed politically impossible now becoming the only logical course of action. We will be watching this very closely, as if Blinken does back the move, as it sounds like he does, it seems to be only a matter of time before Ukraine is permitted to strike forces mobilizing on the front. That will be significant on that axis. The shift may be evidence of pressure being placed on Washington by London. But if so, they're not on the same page on every subject, especially China. Indeed, the US has openly questioned a claim by the UK that Russia and China are working together on combat equipment to be used in Ukraine. Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary who we interviewed on the podcast last week, was speaking at a defence conference here in London yesterday and said that the two countries were collaborating, his words, on lethal aid for Moscow to use in its war against Kyiv. He said, and I quote, "An axis of authoritarian states led by Russia, China, Iran and North Korea have escalated and fueled conflicts and tensions. They have increasingly been working together, and today I can reveal that we have evidence that Russia and China are collaborating on combat equipment for use in Ukraine. Lethal aid is now or will be flowing from China to Russia and into Ukraine." Now, what's interesting is that this claim was quickly disputed by Jake Sullivan, Joe Biden's national security advisor. Asked specifically about Shapps' speech at the daily White House press briefing, Mr. Sullivan replied as follows: "We have not seen that to date. I look forward to speaking with the UK to make sure that we have a common operating picture." Well, Mr. Sullivan, we reported well over a year ago that there was evidence provided by various other newspapers that China was indeed providing some basic weaponry at that time to Russia, further to the all-vital political cover. So it's just a little bit concerning if this is news to the US National Security Advisor. Perhaps you should listen to Ukraine the latest. The other major story I want to cover today, before I have to dash back to the newsroom to do some work actually on it, is the surprise calling of a general election by our Conservative Prime Minister Rishi Sunak yesterday. Now, I'll spare listeners the shambles of how it was announced, which involved Sunak standing outside Downing Street without an umbrella, getting absolutely drenched as somebody blasted out Labour's 1997 campaign anthem. He should have known the only person who can pull off a speech in the rain is President Jeb Bartlett, assisted by Dire Straits. Hats off to those who get the reference. The election will be in 6 weeks' time on Thursday, the 4th of July. It's an election Sunak is widely expected to lose to his Labour rival Keir Starmer, who has nonetheless backed the continued support of Ukraine, at least at the current levels being provided by the British government. But he made, that is Keir Starmer, no reference to Ukraine in his campaign launch speech yesterday after the Prime Minister's, whereas Sunak did several times in his. And I'll quote the relevant parts of the Prime Minister's speech now, because I think they're just worth emphasising. "In the last 5 years, our country has fought through the most challenging times since the Second World War. As I stand here as your Prime Minister, I can't help but reflect that my first proper introduction to you was just over 4 years ago. I told you that we faced a generation-defining moment. We were hit by a pandemic that upended normal life. Then, just as we were recovering from COVID, war returned to Europe, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine sending your energy bills spiralling. Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July. This election will take place at a time when the world is more dangerous than it has been since the end of the Cold War. Putin's Russia is waging a brutal war in Ukraine and will not stop there if he succeeds. That war has also made it all too clear the risk to our energy security. In the Middle East, the forces of Islamist extremism threaten regional and ultimately global stability. These tensions are exploited by extremists who seek to undermine our values and divide our society here at home. China is looking to dominate the 21st century by stealing a lead in technology, and migration is being weaponized by hostile states to threaten the integrity of our borders. These uncertain times call for a clear plan and bold action to chart a course to a secure future. You must choose in this election who has that plan, who is prepared to take the bold action necessary to secure a better future for our country and our children. So that was the Prime Minister yesterday. I expect we will see further announcements about the British Armed Forces and their state over the course of the campaign from all parties. So it is highly relevant to the Ukraine situation for obvious reasons. As we saw only in the past week or so, Britain is still a key player in this conflict, not least in the diplomatic back channels. And I'm pretty convinced that London has been pushing very hard for Washington to give the green light to those weapons uses. So the British perspective on this does still very much matter. So rest assured, we will be keeping listeners informed of the campaign. But it's going to be a long 6 weeks.
Yeah, it feels like it already, Francis. But thanks for that. I note this pressure, the pressure building over this possible change of policies. I think it's very interesting. It's perhaps just as important as which weapons are being sent to Ukraine is which policies are being sent to Ukraine. You know, if that's not a bit too mangled. I just wonder if this issue, the policy over whether Western weapons can be used inside Russia, fired inside Russia, I wonder if this is the stalking horse for other policy positions that may be a bit sort of nose-holdy at the moment, maybe a bit too strong, but are doing the rounds about, out there in the discussion for things like Western medics operating near Ukraine in NATO territory, but under a NATO air defence umbrella, for example, or NATO training staff in the west of the country, and perhaps even, whisper it quietly, German technicians showing Ukrainians how to operate Taurus, because apparently that's so complicated, it's simply not possible to teach Ukrainians how to fire Taurus outside of Ukraine, not like those easy peasy F-16s that you can train anywhere. Anyway, I think it's very interesting that the policy landscape might be shifting. I think perhaps sniffing this in the political wind, sorry about that, President Zelensky, I see, is reportedly planning on attending next month's D-Day commemoration in France and the G7 in Italy. It's reported, Politico say he might be specifically calling on NATO to start shooting down Russian missiles over Ukraine, I guess using the argument about the sort of some members of the alliance did over for Israel recently. That was Politico talking to two people familiar with plans for those meetings, although it could all change. But no, as you say, Francis, really very interesting stuff, movement on the political side, arguably just as important right now, if not more important right now than the actual military aid. But I'm now delighted to turn to our guest, Levison Wood. Lev, great to have you. Please, can I ask you to introduce yourself? I'd only get it all wrong. But tell us how you went from reciting your service number backwards on top of the Trainasium to being an international film star, explorer, pin-up for swooning journalists everywhere, although that might only be the Telegraph.
Gosh, thank you very much, Dominic, and very kind introduction. Well, I joined the army back in 5, served in the parachute regiment, and I suppose having left and seen a bit of the world, I sort of returned to my former passion, which was photography and writing. And so I've spent the sort of last 15 years or so traveling the world, making documentaries on important affairs that are happening, including Ukraine. I've spent quite a bit of time there over the last 18 months myself, and most recently in November, and seeing some of the harrowing things that are happening on the different fronts. So, but on top of that, I sort of got a keen interest in sort of raising awareness about particularly issues surrounding education. I'm an ambassador for UNICEF, and I've done a lot of work all across Africa, South America, and of course Central Asia. And my most recent book was all about Operation Pitting and the fall of Afghanistan. So it's a mixed bag, but I try and use different mediums to tell important stories.
I mean, you're very interested, very active in veterans affairs, which is one of the reasons I wanted to have a chat today. Veterans affairs more broadly, but obviously specifically through the lens of Ukraine. As you say, you spent many months there. Your latest project, The Burn, I'll talk about the specifics in a bit, but The Burn is a search for, or charting the journey of soldiers' redemption, which really, I think is an interesting prospect. Can you explain for us why there is the need for soldiers to seek redemption. What are they seeking it from? Who can bestow such redemption? And is this a personal thing, an individual, a solitary activity, or something that can only happen with the support and encouragement of society, friends, family, and wider society?
Well, I think it's a universal story. Actually, I think it's been the sort of the journey of the veteran. Anyone that's served in the military and seen conflict comes back from that. I think it's a story as old as Homer's Odyssey, frankly, and that's the kind of the ethos of my latest project, is to sort of talk about what processes, emotional, mental processes that veterans must go through to sort of seek that normality. Some people deal with it perfectly fine. Others struggle. And that's, we've seen over the last 15, 20 years with the various conflicts across the Middle East and Afghanistan, that veterans' mental health is thankfully becoming less of a stigma. I think mental health issues in general are becoming less of a stigma. And more attention is given to that. But, as we know, suicide rates are tragically high, particularly amongst young men. But I was in a meeting with a UK charity, Combat Stress, who told me, to my surprise, that often I think the average time that it takes for veterans to report that they have PTSD, whether that's related to a specific incident or if it's the cumulative effect of a number of factors, is on average sort of between 12 to 14 years after having left the forces. So it's a problem that doesn't go away, and often people do need to seek help at various levels. And so this project really is hopefully going to raise awareness about that. And often things like PTSD, and a lot of my friends, have sadly suffered with various mental health issues as a result of their service. And quite often it's not the result of an explosion or an ID. It's simply what happens sometimes when you've seen very intense things, you've experienced abnormal things happening around you. You've seen the very best and the very worst of life, but then, you're thrown out into the civilian world. You might go and get a job at a company or a bank, and then suddenly the sort of the sheen of life is taken away somewhat. And I think what a lot of soldiers and sailors go through. So this really story of redemption is both. It's a personal thing, but it's also part of the collective responsibility of society. If we're going to send soldiers off to war, then I think we all need to do what we can to support them in the aftermath. And, we talk a lot about the military covenant, and it's very important. It's also the soldiers' responsibility, people's responsibility as well. And I've seen I'm an ambassador for a number of veterans charities, all of whom do amazing work. But I think what's telling is that the most effective results are the ones that encourage personal responsibility. It's for people to go out there and accept that perhaps something's not quite right, and they need to go out and seek help themselves. And that's what I encourage people to do. Don't just sit at home feeling sorry for yourself. Go out there and recognize that this is not something that we shouldn't talk about. It's not something you need to keep to yourself. Go out there, ask for some help, and it's there. And this story, I'm basically making a movie about a soldier that has come back from the war in Afghanistan and is struggling in his relationship with his wife, a bit like Odysseus and Penelope in the Odyssey. And basically, they, in a sort of final bid to salvage the relationship, his wife takes him to a music festival, which is a sort of a bit of a juxtaposition to the sort of idea of conflict. It's all about peace and love and all the rest of it. And it's really, the Odyssey all happens in the space of 24 hours. And I think that's the interesting bit. We all have our personal Odyssey, and sometimes it takes 14 years. Sometimes it can happen in a much shorter time frame. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is bring all these ideas together to raise awareness about these very important issues, and hopefully offer people a bit of a beacon of hope and encourage people to realize that they're not alone in dealing with this.
Yeah, now you've spent, as we've said, quite a bit of time in Ukraine. How do you think these ideas will land there? And do you think Ukrainian society will need to go through a similar sort of process, or, I hate to use the word journey, but, a lot of these things are, I don't particularly like the term post-traumatic stress disorder. There is a place for that, of course, but I think a lot of what I've seen in friends of mine, friends of ours who have suffered and still struggle with many of these issues, it was actually a post or a traumatic stress event. So post that, hence the PTS, but it was an understandable response, a logical. It was a human. It was what the body does to survive. So it wasn't a disorder. It was perfectly natural. Now, how that might have manifested itself might have been odd and strange for a peaceful society. But shouting and maybe even occasionally doing other things, that's not necessarily a disorder. I don't like the framing that there's something wrong. It might be correct. So that's just my particular bugbear, and I'm treading very carefully because I'm not qualified in this, and I don't want to suggest I am.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think there's different manifestations of this, and there's a great book by a guy called Ben Timberlake who talks about this a lot. The book's called High Risk, and he was in the military and then served as a security consultant in lots of different conflict zones. But he talks about post-traumatic growth as well. It can work both ways. We all know that, without a bit of risk, there's no reward, and we need to push ourselves to sort of develop new tendencies and to expand our sort of way of looking at life. So I don't think it always needs to be negative. And I think that's something, hopefully that in itself offers a bit of a glimmer of light to people out there, that actually just because you've been through a rough situation and a rough patch as a result, that's not it. You don't need to define yourself by the negative aspects of that. And I think that there's a lot of work that's going into this, studies through things like psychedelics and so on, that's really trying to understand how the mind works when it comes to life after a traumatic event. And I think that hopefully, we are going in the right direction with this. But I think the first step really is to encourage people to understand that they're not alone in this, they're not isolated, and to enable people to come together. And I think that whether it's in the UK or the States or in Ukraine, Ukraine has, as we know, seen some of the bloodiest combat in generations, frankly. And there's going to be a whole generation of young men and women who will struggle in the aftermath. So I think it's something that we need to be aware of. It's something that the country will need to address sooner rather than later. And I know that there are already organisations. We've got British organisations that are offering mental health advice and more practical advice as well to soldiers coming off the front line. It was interesting. The last time I was there, you'd got, units who were coming back from fighting in the Donbass, going to Kyiv for the sort of weekend and going out clubbing and then going straight back to the front line. So it's very unusual, very unlike our sort of operational tours that we're kind of used to. But for in Ukraine, when you're fighting an existential threat, when you're fighting total war, which it really is for Ukraine, you have to deal with it in a very different way. And I think that sense of community, that real sense of tribe. I don't know if you've read Sebastian Junger's book, Tribe. He talks a lot about the cohesiveness of military units. And in fact, actually, the ones that struggle the least are the ones often on the very front lines. It's those with a very solid identity. Often, the paras, the Marines, the like, are people who struggle the least, which is a really interesting one. Not because they're harder, but because they've got a really solid sense of brand identity almost, which helps them to deal with some of these problems collectively.
Yeah, it's a subject I'm particularly interested in. I'm going to keep a very close eye on with our friends and colleagues in Ukraine. And if you're in the US, I couldn't recommend more highly the Boulder Crest Foundation. We've spoken to them a number of times. I visited them when we were in the US last year. They've got a site. Their first site actually was in Virginia. They've got a site also in Arizona. It's veterans. They've expanded out of veterans. It's to first responders as well now. It came out of 9/11, set up by a guy who was a firefighter present on 9/11. So it's sort of morphed from the veteran community into sort of wider first responders. But, really interesting stuff. If anybody wants to have a greater look at that and perhaps, ask some questions, they are a good bunch of guys, the Boulder Crest Foundation. Anyway, finally, Lev, The Burn. I want to hear about The Burn, this latest project, your film, because it sounds really interesting. It covers many of the issues, I think, that we've just been discussing. But you're specifically asking for help from the veterans community. You're looking for technical people, and as I understand it, any veterans out there who are with dashing good looks and a winning smile. Am I on the right lines?
Absolutely. So, this is all part of a wider project. I've made 11 or 12 documentaries now. This is my first foray into, drama, fiction filmmaking. But, it's a great opportunity, actually. And I'm using this platform to offer some employment opportunities to veterans in the forms of, if you're leaving the services and looking for a job as a technical advisor or even as an actor. I'm helping young budding script writers as well. And all of this is creative industries. I'm trying to create a real opportunity and a platform for employment. But for this project specifically, I'm looking for investors. I'm looking for people that want to get stuck in and help those veterans as well. So if anyone out there wants to help me make a movie, I'm all ears, and please do get in touch. There's a Kickstarter page out there as well. So there's some really cool rewards for people who want to come on board.
Brilliant. Well, I'll keep an eye out for anyone who fits the bill there. But Lev, thanks so much. Come back to you in a moment if you've got time to stick around for final thoughts. I have one actually, just before. I know it's not always that normal for the host to do anything, but I just wanted to say the last couple of days I was away. I was down in Bordeaux with one of our videographers here, Jack Leather, brilliant bloke, the Leather Man. And we were doing something for D-Day. It's going to be coming out in a couple of weeks' time. And what I was looking at was an operation launched by the SAS, B Squadron of the 1st SAS. There was more than one SAS regiment at the time. So B Squadron of the 1st SAS down in Western France. And cut a pretty long and tragic story short. It resulted in 30 SAS men being taken captive by the Germans and then all murdered. Shot, 27 of them shot buried in shallow graves. 3 of them, I mean, horrifically, they were wounded in the action when their forest hideout was attacked. 3 of them were taken to hospital in Poitiers and they were treated, and then they were murdered by lethal injection by a German doctor. I mean, it's awful. But I'm using it to explain that the D-Day operation was much wider than what was just happening on the beaches and in Normandy. And I'm trying to show a different aspect that people might not have heard about before. So have a look at Operation Bull Basket. But the reason I mention it is because I spoke to people rather beautifully at the end of the war. And what we understand today is the Commonwealth War Graves Commission went to all the local villages where soldiers had been buried and said, look, let's put them all together into these bigger sites that we recognise today, because that way we can look after them better. It's not an ownership thing. It's just, we can better administer them and look after those that have fallen. And a very small number of French villages, including Rome, where I went to visit, said no, these men died for us. They died for our town, our village. They died fighting for us. So it's our responsibility. We're going to look after them. We are going to remember them. We are going to tend their graves. We are going to make sure that nobody forgets what they did. And that's what's happened. And it's absolutely beautiful. And so in this lovely little tiny French village, there are 27 graves and a stone marking the other 3 men that were killed in the hospital. Their bodies, it's not known where they lie. And there's also a US Army Air Force pilot, Lieutenant Lincoln Bundy, who was a Mustang pilot. He was shot down and was working his way through the area to try and get down to Spain and out through the escape line. He was with the SAS men when they were all attacked, so he was shot as well. So there's this beautiful area of the town cemetery. And then just to the north, about 5 k's north, is the Bois du Guron, the Guron Wood. And that's where the shallow graves are. And they've been marked as well. And I was stood there in this lovely wood, a sunny day, and yet it was so strange, just felt so odd to be stood in a place where 80 years ago, such violence and such an egregious humanity or lack of humanity, egregious human behavior took place. It was very strange, rather chilling indeed. I just hope we did it justice. I think it's good. We're still working on it. That's going to be out in a couple of weeks. But just to be in these spaces, and we've seen it in Ukraine as well, when we visited Bucha and people who live there now and elsewhere, and we're seeing it in Vovchansk, we will see it elsewhere in territory once it's liberated. I mean, it is extraordinary to be in a place, not the time, but the same place where such acts have taken place and such crimes committed. It really does make you think about your humanity and who you are and what you can do to try and make this a slightly better place. Yeah, it was very touching, actually, very affecting. I ask everyone to have a little think about it if you've got time, and if you so wish, have a look at the film in a couple of weeks. But it was very affecting. And I then went back with Jack to the city of Bordeaux, which is very nice, and we managed to find the only bistro in Bordeaux that didn't serve French wine, only served Italian wine. Couldn't make it up. Anyway, Lev, any final thoughts you'd like to share with the gang?
If I can share one story about Ukraine, I'll keep it brief. But when I was there in November, I was actually out there in search of trees. I'm writing a book about the human connection with nature and all about land and wild spaces. And Ukraine's got some very beautiful forests. And I was very surprised to hear that there are still wildlife rangers, conservationists, forest rangers out there protecting Ukraine's forests, even on the front line. So I'd gone up to Donbass and I'd gone down to a place called Kamyansky Sich, which is just outside of Kherson, in search of one particular man who I really want to just pay enormous tribute to, because I found this guy, his name is Sergei Skorsky, and he set up a national park back in 2019. It's Ukraine's youngest national park, right on the Dnipro River. And basically, when the Russians invaded, he was captured on the second day of the war. He was locked in a basement with all of the other Rangers, with a whole bunch of other men for a week, where he was tortured, shockingly. And then after a week, he was told to go outside and dig his own grave. Sergei decided a better option would be, when the Russians were not looking, to do a runner, swim across the Dnipro River at its widest point. And bear in mind, end of February, it was still half frozen over, and he managed to escape, which in itself was just truly remarkable. But just a week later, he'd signed up with Ukrainian armed forces and was fighting the Russians by day, but always going back to the national park to check up on his beloved trees.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war ramps up, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Elliot Lampitt. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.